Hey friends, I'm Otis Gibbs, and this is my buddy Guthrie Trapp. He's going to share a story about touring with Paul Simon.
Well, we were on the bus one night somewhere, and Jerry goes, "Hey guys, I think you guys are really going to like this." Because there was some pretty heavy jazz guys in that band, Todd Parks and Doug Below. You know, they loved Steve Gadd and like the whole thing. I mean, we had deep respect for Paul Simon, and I loved the African records and the whole thing. I mean, of course, it's Paul Simon. And so Jerry goes, "I think we're going to be opening up for Paul Simon for 3 months on his tour for Surprise, the record that I think Brian Eno did. Don't quote me on any of this. I'm not a historian about anything." But, and then of course we were like, "What? Are you kidding me?" It's like, we're already playing with Jerry Douglas. Now we're going to go out and work with Paul Simon for 3 months. Amazing. So we did. We booked this 3-month thing, and we opened up for Paul all over the place, all across the country. We did Radio City Music Hall. We started in Seattle and worked our way all over the place. We played radio. I know I've mentioned Radio City Music Hall a few times because this is a memorable one for me. Paul Simon in New York at Radio City Music Hall. It was kind of it was like, you know, eating. The only other thing we could do was more American was if we had some apple pie there. I mean, I don't know. Actually, we did Cooperstown with Paul Simon on the 4th of July. That was pretty. Wow. That was pretty American. Which that was a fun one too. But so we're at Radio City Music Hall, and the dressing room is up at on the 3rd floor. So we get on the elevator, we go down, the show's over. I'm back on the elevator to go back up to the dressing room to get my shit together, you know, and I've got my guitar case. And so I go up to the 3rd floor. The elevator is now open this way. I'm walking out the elevator, and there's a mob of people in a giant group right in front of me. And I can barely, like, they're falling into the elevator. I can barely get through. I've got this big Colton case with my acoustic guitar and probably a backpack and a pedal board and all this shit. And I'm just trying to get to the dressing room to get, you know, packed up. And there's all these people, and there's a center, and there's Paul in the middle, and he's talking to like Brian Eno, and there's all these people there. Who knows who was there that I didn't recognize? You know, it's New York, it's Paul Simon. I'm like a kid, and I'm like, what the hell? And so I'm at this point going, "Excuse me, hey, can I get through to, you know, excuse me, sir, can I get through?" And I'm walking through this mob of people, and to get to the hallway that's right here. And I come to this guy, and I look up at him, and I go, hey man, excuse me, I just get through right there. And I look up at him, and I go, "Hey man, Art Garfunkel." And he goes, "No man, John McEnroe." And Mike Bubb will tell you this whole story because. So I went, "Oh, God." I said, "So sorry, man. Nice to meet you." And he goes, "Yeah." And I kept walking. But if you look at some of those photos of those two guys, they kind of, you know, if you're young and probably, you know, I'm walking through there. I'm like, this guy kind of looks like Art Garfunkel. He goes, "No, man, John McEnroe." And I went, "Oh, awesome. Nice to meet you." He goes, "Yeah." And so then fast forward to our dear brother, Mike Bubb, who we've been in a million bands together and just have had a total blast. I talked to him on the phone earlier. He was at Steve Martin's house for New Year's Eve a few years back through the whole Steve Martin bluegrass thing, and Tim O'Brien or something. They all ended up there. And they're at his apartment overlooking Central Park, and John McEnroe's there. And Mike Bubb walks up to John and goes, "Hey, man, I got a funny story for you." He goes, "Buddy of mine was playing guitar at Radio City, you know, 20 years ago, 30 years ago." He said, "Yeah, he thought you were Art Garfunkel." And John McEnroe goes, "Yeah, tell that guy to fuck off." So that was a, you know, case of mistaken identity. And so we would sound check. How does it work? When you're the opening act, you sound check last. So they would do these big, like we'd call it the matinee. I think a few people call it. I think Vince Gill's known for long sound checks too. They call that the matinee. But Paul would do these like 2-hour sound checks. And Steve Gadd and Vincent Ngini, who's since passed, the main African guitar player, they played all these iconic licks that we know off of these records. But Keithy Kamalo was playing bass. I mean, he's the guy from all the stuff we've heard. Steve Gadd's back there. And we're flipping out, and so we'd always sound check. Well, first of all, we'd go to every one of Paul's sound checks because, I mean, that was just,
And Paul was
dude, we're getting a performance for 2 hours. And not only that, but we're getting to see Steve Gadd and Vincent screaming at each other on stage. And it's crazy. So we're all sitting in whatever venue we're at watching this sound check go down for 2.5 hours. And so we would sound check, and then Paul would be coming off the stage and we'd be coming on the stage. That's how it works, because the opening act always sound checks last on those big gigs. So I'd always pass Paul, and he's the only guy. Him and John Oates are only the two people in show business shorter than I am. And so Paul would be walking out, and he'd stop, and it was always just like a little, the most small talk you've ever had with anybody. It would be like, "Hey man, he'd go, "Hey man, how's it sound out there today?" I go, "Man, pretty good, Paul." I said, "You might want to get a sweater though. It's a little chilly out there," or something. It was something like that, like it turned into like either how did it sound or what was the weather like, what was the temperature, or something. It's something's crazy. So, but he always would speak to you and that kind of stuff. Now, this is what's funny. He loves Louisiana, and he's enamored with New Orleans and South Louisiana culture, Lafayette, the whole thing. And he goes and records at Dockside, and all this kind of stuff, or has in the past a lot. So Katrina had just happened, and we were out there, and my dad, who still lives on the Gulf Coast, we were in Atlanta at Chastain Park, and there's all these tour buses backstage. I mean, it's a one after the other, and there's like rows of tour buses. And I walk out there to go to catering or something, and my parents were there because it was like one of the closest things to the Gulf Coast we did was Atlanta. I'm walking through the tour bus thing, and I turn and I look, and in between two tour buses in this little area, there's my dad and Paul standing there talking. And my dad goes, "Man, we talked for about an hour," because he was so intrigued by Katrina and the hurricane and the Gulf Coast and the whole thing. And my dad is a well-traveled, well-read, awesome dude, and he's a great conversationalist. And so him and Paul, my dad probably said something to him in passing or something like, "Hey, Paul, Guthrie's dad," or something, And they talked. He said, "Man, they talked for over an hour about the Gulf Coast and the hurricane and all that." The thing I think I learned about that with him was when we would watch those sound checks, just the fact that somebody that has played 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover 10,000 times, they're still honing the groove and the arrangement or whatever it is, the dynamics and the volume of the instruments on stage. Somebody like that, and I'll throw John Oates in there, Gibbons, Paul Simon, guys that could have checked out a long time ago that still show up every day like they just picked up the guitar for the first time, and they got the fire to the artistic integrity has never diminished at all. So I mean, Paul could get up and play that song or all those songs, in his sleep with the guitar behind his head backwards. He's played them so many times. And Steve Gadd, the most legendary drummer on those records, the groove on 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover and all this stuff, those guys can play those songs in their sleep. But to get out there and be doing a 2-hour sound check and dialing in the mix and getting the acoustic guitar to sound, I mean, his acoustic guitar sounds fantastic. Like him and James Taylor have the best live acoustic guitar sound ever. And just dialing that stuff in on such a high level where Steve and the guitar player, there's no, it's an intense musical environment because those guys are so good, but they also, it's not like just like, "Oh yeah, we're playing with Paul," and it's like great. Like those guys are like screaming at each other on stage every day. "Vincent, I can't hear. Your guitar's too loud. You got to turn it down. It's messing with my kick drum," and blah, blah, blah. And then Vincent's like, "Steve, blah, 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 blah." It's like, "Oh, is that?" And they're screaming at each other. And then, of course, they love each other. But on the bandstand, it's like, man, they're fighting for what's going to make them music the best it can possibly be. Being on stage with Jerry Douglas and playing those virtually impossible songs, that we had to really, really, really have our shit together. There was no drinking before that gig,
And play it in front of, deliver it to this very large crowd every night.
And delivering it to a large crowd every night. And you're up there with an acoustic guitar playing these very difficult songs with Jerry. But the thing that I really learned about from Jerry on that gig was the fact that we'd be at Radio City Music Hall or some big place, and we're playing his music, and he's stepping out there, and he is pushing the envelope on his songs to where he's pushing it to where he's almost about to fall off the cliff, and then of course recovers very nicely, and as we all do, people that are pushing the envelope. And so now with my trio, I've kind of adopted that same kind of mindset of like, hey man, we're going to push this envelope, and we might make a couple mistakes, but at least we're out of our comfort zone, and it's creating some energy of some sort. And so I learned that from playing with Jerry and realizing that it's okay to almost fall apart and bring it right back. And that's what's going to keep it pushing right to that, and then the mark moves, and you're going, it's raising the ceiling every time.
The audience feels it.
You're feeling that energy. And so to me, that was a big lesson there too, is it's okay if even if you're in front of a lot of people at a really nice performing arts center, you can still, that doesn't mean that like it's really delicate and you don't need to break the china. Like, let's get out there and like, let's go for it, And that was an amazing thing. So the other cool thing about that tour was we were all in catering together. And so Doug, our drummer, would be able to, forge this amazing relationship with Steve Gadd and friendship through the New Orleans drumming. He's a genius drummer, amazing drummer, and a total character. And so him and Steve Gadd got to be really good friends, and they went jogging together and all this cool stuff. So it was a lot of just cool stuff that happened. I hung with the Africans, they'd be out in the alley smoking weed and cigarettes and drinking. And I'd be like, geez, these guys, like and then they'd get up on stage, and it was just the most amazing stuff ever. I'm a huge fan of the world music aspect of all that. But we got to hang at catering with these guys, and we, you're getting some salad, and you're next to Steve, and he's like, hey, man, how's it going today? Well, it's great, man. So that was awesome, too, the access that we had to the band and just hanging with the band guys, And they loved the music because it's Jerry, and we're out there playing this crazy instrumental music. So it was very cool.
And he's on the tour because Paul loves him.
Yeah, and they play together, and Jerry would come out and play the boxer with him, and it wasn't just like, yes, it was a very nice connection. It wasn't like, oh, hey, who are these guys? What management put this band on the opening act? It's like, yeah, they had a relationship, which was kind of nice. We weren't looked at as like, who are these young kids in here? Who are these punks eating our food, It's like, okay, these guys are supposed to be here. Great. So if you're on the road, you're spending a lot of time with those guys, as you know. I mean, you're not just, if you go to a session, which I don't do a whole lot of, you go to a session, you're with a group of people for a day, or it could be 3 or 4 hours, and you're done, you come home, you're out with those guys, you're together for weeks at a time, and you're getting to know these guys really, really well. And so I think that's just why there's so many stories, because you're taking a group of guys that are a bunch of knuckleheads, for lack of a better term, and you're putting them in every daily situation.
Extreme situations.
And extreme situations. You could be trying to find food at a truck stop 1 minute, and then the next minute you're in New York City and you're eating it's like you're at an airport, you're in a van, you're in a bus, you're on a boat, you're all the things, and you're with these guys, and you're seeing every character navigating through this. Thank God there's a tour manager, or we would never ended up anywhere. I mean, I've been detained in Norway and kicked off a plane in Scotland, and I mean, the stories of those days in our 20s where we were running pretty hard. I mean, we're lucky to be alive and not be in jail. But we survived and we learned from it, and that's all part of it.